Hi, everyone. So I'd like to start this teach-in off with a land acknowledgement. So I'm currently conducting this teach-in from Toronto. I am a settler and therefore an uninvited guest on this land. This land is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We must recognize the oppressive and violent process of colonialization that has brought about this country as we know it, and in doing so, work to be better allies. Today, the process of colonization is continuing to take place across so-called Canada, and in Fridays for Future, we like to work on providing some substance in our land acknowledgements to make them more meaningful. So today, I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight Eve Saint, who is an Indigenous land defender from Wet'suwet'en, who was arrested at Gidimt'en checkpoint during the RCMP invasion on February 7th. And she is also the daughter of the hereditary chief Woos of Gidimt'en. In response to the changes evoked by COVID-19, Saint said that the year 2020 has certainly been historic for some already, with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs evicted, evicting CGL, living on the land the way we were meant to be, the RCMP raid, shutting down Canada, and now a pandemic that has shut down the world. It's definitely a particular time, but not a time to let this stop our progress in fighting climate change and standing for Indigenous rights. Saint also described the challenges Indigenous people and communities are facing during this pandemic and what settlers can do to help, saying, Indigenous people have been removed from their homes and land since colonization, and we see a lot of displacement and homelessness in Indigenous communities. There are families that may not have the means to get the food and supplies they need, especially with jobs shutting down, or be at more of a health risk going into public spaces. So, if you're interested in supporting local Indigenous folks, please consider making a donation to this Indigenous Youth Outreach Initiative, which is spearheaded by Nanook, who is an Indigenous activist here in Toronto. So in this initiative, they've been handing out warm dinners, care packages, medicines, and harm reduction kits, and are looking for funds to expand. So tomorrow, with Fridays for Future's weekly climate strike, Nanook will be a guest on the live stream, so tune in there to hear more about her initiative and work as an activist in Toronto. So my name is Kendall Marr. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Union Labour Outreach Coordinator with Fridays for Future Toronto. Today, I will be facilitating this teach-in on a just transition and just recovery, where we will explore various perspectives on the intersections between labor and climate. Before I start, I would like to go over some housekeeping items. So first, I would like to remind everyone that Fridays for Future has a strict policy against hate speech, including sexist, racist, ableist, homophobic, xenophobic, and transphobic comments. We have a zero tolerance for these types of comments, whether directed at our members or supporters. Please leave the call if you're not able to interact meaningfully and respectfully in discussion. Secondly, we want to provide an opportunity to have meaningful discussion as a collective group, so please don't hesitate to share throughout the presentation in the chat or live by voice during the designated discussion periods. If you write in the chat, I can read it out loud so others can respond, so you do not have to wait to the end to ask questions. Third, this call is being recorded. If you're uncomfortable showing your face, please click the camera button on your screen to leave your camera off for the duration of the presentation. And lastly, I would like to thank you all for being here today. I cannot express my gratitude in those taking time out of their days to continue to think about and discuss ideas about how to move forward in organizing and mobilize folks as we deal with the health crisis that is COVID-19. So this is the presentation overview of what we will be talking about today. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is what is the role of a just transition and the climate crisis. And first we have to talk about what we're transitioning from and what we're transitioning to. So breaking down the term into its component parts, we must understand the transition. And our goal is not simply a transition away from high carbon industries, but an overhaul of our current system in favor of one that is sustainable with the natural world. So this includes mitigating existing issues, transforming industry away from unsustainable practices, and increased support for infrastructure that supports communities. So a just transition means a society that shares the cost of transitioning and therefore recognizes that it would be unjust for workers and communities in affected sectors to shoulder the full cost of transition. In practice, just transition requires cooperation and collaboration among workers, unions, employees, communities, families, and all levels of government. Together, they actively identify and implement opportunities to develop skills, secure decent work, sustainably develop communities, and enhance social protections. So Fridays for Future understands that if a just transition is going to be both effective at curbing emissions and just for workers, much of its framework must come from bottom-up consultation and include workplace actions to force change. We also must keep in mind that we are being countered by corporations that have political power and resources to continue advancing their agenda. In order to build the collective power to achieve a just transition, everyone must become engaged and involved in the conversation. So not only workers, but communities as well. So a report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives highlights the shortcomings of current transition plans and recommendations. And the report calls for just transition policies to be expanded so they apply to all workers in affected communities rather than specific industry workers, and for more direct funding to programs and institutions that recruit and train women, Indigenous, and racialized individuals, as well as immigrants in the skilled trades. This is a report depending on what has happened so far in Canada. So it is imperative that marginalized groups and workers and communities impacted by climate change policies who have historically been left out of the conversation be included in consultations for implementing a strategy of a just transition. And these groups face a risk facing even greater inequity if Canada's just transition is not expanded. So we recommend that and demand that these communities have access to programs to ease the transition, such as training for green jobs, urban agriculture, and adequate transition, instead of being left behind. Indigenous communities have also been stewards of the land since time immemorial and put sustainable interchange at the forefront of their way of life. Indigenous communities have been faced with the ongoing crisis that is colonialism, and have historically been left out of consultations on matters of environmental stewardship that directly impact culturally relevant practices. And Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by environmental racism, where environmental hazards such as toxic waste facilities and industrial facilities are often placed close to Indigenous communities. So it is imperative that Indigenous communities be included in a just transition. So the Indigenous Environmental Network has proposed a transformation for actions that reject commodifying of nature, take greater responsibility for how we interact with our ecosystem, and distinct material and spiritual relationships with the land, territory, water, and ecosystems. So a just transition so these are the principles of a just transition with the Indigenous community. So a just transition has been attempted in Canada on a small scale with coal-powered workers transitioning away from coal energy. However, this is not to the scale we need, but gives a framework on which we can build. Some outcomes from the project include recognition that a just transition must become an integral part of climate action plans as the world transitions to a low-carbon economy, without which we risk increased polarization on the issue and eroding of public support for action on climate change. So it shows us we have a window of opportunity, the tools, authorities, and resources to adopt and implement these recommendations, and all that we need is global leadership to transition. Fridays for Future has adopted an intersectional approach to climate justice outlined by our collective demands, one of which includes a just transition. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been a source of realization for many. It has laid bare for us to witness the devastating impact of inadequate investment in social services and has cost many people their lives. It has also illustrated the compounding impact of social inequities and discrimination across society. COVID-19 also comes at the very moment in history we must act on climate in order to have tangible impact on turning the tides. And this crisis has shown us that there are sufficient resources for us to act appropriately in times of crisis. The issues with the current system serve as a reminder that we must demand better. Similar to the way a just transition talks about how we move forward into a sustainable economy, a just recovery talks about how we push for a new normal in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, one that guarantees a future for all people that is equitable and sustainable. More specifically, a just recovery ensures that all those impacted by the crisis, those without jobs, benefits, facing eviction, are supported. In addition, a just recovery ensures that the need for tangible items like PPE and safe working conditions for frontline medical staff are at the forefront of our priorities. So as I mentioned, the word recovery can imply a return to the way things were. However, back to normal does mean social inequities, weak public services and infrastructure, oppression of Indigenous nations, and imminent threat of climate crisis. A common theme throughout a just recovery, so we cannot go back to the way things were, but rather look towards and demand better. So a common theme throughout a just recovery is the demand to put money where it's needed to ensure that we minimize the negative impact on individuals and communities who suffer losses during this pandemic and are able to prosper as we move forward and towards reopening of the economy. Rather than bailing out banks, oil companies, the just recovery principles demand that the people and the workers should be bailed out. This includes measures during the crisis, such as abolishing rent, paid sick days to workers, support for isolated communities, but also includes expanding public services for jobs and to provide health resiliency. As we speak, organizations across Canada are working hard to finalize and endorse a number of overarching principles for a just recovery that encompass a just transition to sustainable practices, equity for historically marginalized groups, and resilience in future crises. In consultation with many groups, these principles will amplify voices and encompass lived experiences specific and applicable in the Canadian context. As these principles have yet to be made publicly available, I will share the more general principles from 350.org today, which follow the same thread. So these more specific Canadian principles will launch soon at the website on the page, justrecoveryforall.ca. So the principles from 350.org are: 1, put people's health first, no exceptions. So resources for health services everywhere and must ensure access for all. 2, they provide economic relief directly to the people. So a focus on people and workers, particularly those in marginalized and existing systems, for short-term and long-term conditions. 3 is helping workers and communities, not corporate executives. So assistance directed at specific industries must be channeled to communities and workers, not shareholders and corporate executives, and never to corporations that don't commit on taking action against the climate crisis. 4 is creating resilience for future crises. So we must create millions of decent jobs that help power a just recovery and transition for workers and communities to the zero carbon future we need. And the last one is build solidarity and communities across borders. So don't transfer technology and finance to lower income countries and communities to allow them to respond using these principles and share solutions across borders and communities. Do not use crises as an excuse to trample on human rights, civil liberties, and democracy. So at this point, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Rebecca Keats. Rebecca was working until recently as at the General Motors Oshawa assembly plant, but was laid off. Rebecca is a member of Unifor Local 222 Education Committee and Political Action Committee, and an organizer with Green Jobs Oshawa, a coalition of union activists, academics, environmentalists, and community members. Green Jobs Oshawa has been calling for the conversion of the GM assembly plant under public ownership to manufacture socially beneficial products as needed to combat climate change, rising inequity, and most recently, personal protective equipment for workers during this pandemic. On behalf of Fridays for Future Toronto and those tuning in, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on behalf of Green Jobs Oshawa. So I'll start with a little bit of background into who we are and how we came about. So General Motors has been producing vehicles at their facility in Oshawa for just over 100 years. It has an area of approximately 10 million square feet and has produced in excess of 20 million vehicles. On November 26, 2018, GM announced that the Oshawa facility, along with 4 other North American plants, would be unallocated. On December 18, 2019, the last truck rolled off the line and thousands in Oshawa and the surrounding community were left unemployed. In 2009, GM of Canada received almost $11 billion in government assistance to keep the company afloat. The company and the Canadian government demanded major concessions from workers to secure the bailout money. While GM rapidly returned to profitability and has made billions of dollars in profit, workers did not regain any of their losses and in fact continued losing ground. 2-tiered wages with a 10-year grow-in, virtually no wage increases in over a decade, the elimination of the defined benefit pension plan for new workers, the loss of inflation protection for retirees' pensions, the massively expanded use of temporary workers, and the outsourcing of jobs, to name a few. It was a complete victory for the corporation, and still they chose to abandon Oshawa. It is a cruel lesson in the absolute evil of multinational capitalist corporations, and a stark example of what normal has become for workers. So who is Green Jobs Oshawa? Green Jobs Oshawa is a coalition of workers, environmentalists, academics, and community members. We recognized in the midst of a climate crisis requiring immediate action and a community facing massive job loss and disruption, the need for a bold idea. Bring the plant under democratic control through government ownership and build battery electric vehicles or other products that meet social need instead of corporate greed. To bring this vision to life, we commissioned a preliminary feasibility study, launched a website, did media interviews, created a Facebook page, spoke at events, and raised awareness that another way is possible. Our message was covered by mainstream television and daily newspapers. We were asked to speak at a global climate strike in Toronto and participated in events on public ownership and just transitions. The preliminary feasibility study can be found at greenjobsoshawa.ca, and it was based on a triple bottom line. It was based on social, environmental, and economic benefits. The study showed that a publicly owned assembly operation in Oshawa could create up to 13,000 jobs, build 150,000 battery electric vehicles in 5 years, reduce CO2 emissions by 400,000 tons, and break even in year 4 while making an actual profit by year 5. Now, the foundation of this vision is that there is an approaching crisis which requires decisive and bold action on a scale that must be mandated by government. Individuals cannot do this alone. We must recognize that decisions based on corporate profits are not in the best interest of workers, communities, or society. We believe that manufacturing capacity must be protected so that we are able to respond quickly and effectively to any challenges. We believe that not only must we recognize essential workers, but that there is also essential manufacturing that is necessary for the sustainability of our future. However, that manufacturing should not be done for profit, which is why we are promoting a publicly owned Crown corporation that could use the principles of democratic planning and production based on societal need. We shouldn't accept corporations trying to make a greedy dollar off the backs of all of us in a time of need. And then the COVID-19 crisis came along, and unsurprisingly, the foundations of our call for government intervention at the GM Oshawa facility became even more relevant and urgent as Canadians quickly became aware of how unprepared we were for this pandemic. Lives have been put at risk and lost due to inadequate personal protective equipment. We don't need hospital workers, long-term care workers, transit drivers, grocery and food supply workers, and every other person that has now been recognized as essential to be heroes risking their lives every day at work to help others. We need them to be able to confidently and safely go to work knowing they have the proper personal protective equipment to keep them safe and their families safe. So Green Jobs Oshawa has raised our voice to call on the Prime Minister and the Premier of Ontario to immediately order the production of essential medical equipment and supplies at the mostly vacant GM Oshawa complex. And we're happy to say that on April 24th, they did announce that they were going to be producing masks at the GM Oshawa plant, but they're only producing the level 1 surgical masks and not the desperately needed N95 masks, which we can produce and should be producing there. So the fight continues. It is clear that this is not the only crisis we will find ourselves in if we do not take immediate action on climate as well. This is also the type of action that we need to take now. Public ownership and conversion by themselves are not a cure-all solution, but public ownership and conversion provide an opportunity to serve the needs of the greater good in a manner that provides democratic control, long-term planning around need instead of profit. It battles gross inequality and tackles the climate crisis. The only way to take advantage of this opportunity is to organize. And I know it's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity because we need to build a better future. We aren't just trying to survive, but we want to thrive. We need to organize workers, community members, technical experts, environmentalists, and every person that wants a better tomorrow. We know that healthcare workers, healthcare and other vital services must be public, not run for private profit. Protecting manufacturing and transforming our economy to sustainable energy are just as important and cannot be left to corporate decision makers. The lack of preparation for this pandemic is a stark warning that a Green New Deal must be launched now. We must do better and think bigger. Green Jobs Oshawa recognizes that we must take on both climate justice and social justice. Not only do we need to move away from fossil fuels and wasteful consumption, from harm and devastation, but we must build healthy, resilient communities while creating a strong, sustainable economy. We must demand massive government investment in green energy, green technology, and electrification. The government must take action, such as the immediate electrification of government fleet vehicles and public transportation. This must include public ownership of key manufacturing and resource sectors. The environmental movement and the labor movement must demand this transformation include a just transition for workers and communities. And what is a just transition? To add to Kendall's comments, I would say a just transition means environmental justice, social justice, and economic justice. It means leaving no community or worker behind while creating a sustainable future. A just transition is intentional. It is done with commitment and planning. It means properly funding strategies for success. And a just transition is about respect, most of all. Respect for our planet, for the environment, and respect for each other in the future. We need to invest in people, not profits, protect communities, not corporations, and we need to think bigger than we ever have before. Public need must come before corporate greed. Corporations continue to show complete disregard for environmental and social devastation caused in the pursuit of profits, and they just won't stop if we don't demand change. We need to change the system. This is the way to protect communities, provide decent jobs, and create a sustainable planet for the future. I would just also like to take a moment to ask if anybody who's on here and hasn't done could go to greenjobsoshawa.ca and sign on to our petition asking that the government order production of N95 masks at the GM Oshawa plant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. And this is a great segue into the next part of the presentation, which is looking at how we can support different initiatives, including Green Jobs Oshawa. So I'd like to maybe open the floor to anyone who is interested in asking a question to Rebecca, or more generally about anything that we have talked about. So if you're interested in asking a question, you can message in the chat and say that you want to ask a question in voice, or you can type your question in the chat. And if you want to ask by voice, one of our hosts can unmute you to ask your question. But maybe I can start with one question for Rebecca, which is, other than the action you just proposed, which is signing the demand for N95 masks to be produced at the GM plant, how can other individuals in the community continue to support and start supporting Green Jobs Oshawa campaign?
So things, I mean, we still have the other petition that was calling for the government to produce electric vehicles at the GM plant. So that would be very helpful, as well as contacting any members of government, provincially or federally. This isn't something that is just about Oshawa. This is an example using Oshawa of what can be done and what needs to happen at different locations across the country. So having conversations about public ownership and starting to put a positive spin on it and acknowledge that it can be a strength instead of just acknowledging the myths that are out there and buying into the stories that public ownership means inefficiency or waste or laziness, and that's just not the case. We can determine what public ownership looks like, and we can determine how it's run, but most importantly is that it can't be for profit. So I mean, having these conversations is really important. Promoting our website and our page is also very useful. So if you can share, we are on Facebook at Green Jobs Oshawa. So if you're on Facebook, if you can share it amongst users, or if you know of other organizations that might be interested in being able to amplify our message, we'd appreciate that.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, the floor is open. You can message in the chat to be unmuted, or ask the question as a text.
Yeah, this is Brian. I'm one of the co-hosts, so I just unmuted myself. Hope that's not a problem. But thank you very much, Kendall and Rebecca, for the great presentation. I just have a question, because I know that one of the, about the Green Jobs Oshawa campaign, I know that it came about sort of also with a collaborative aspect with CUPW in terms of putting forward a proposal for making, electric fleet for the postal workers. And then and I was just also thinking about the recent campaign by Foodsters United, sort of representing young workers in the gig economy organizing with CUPW. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on maybe that, and as well the opportunities that there are, and I guess this question is for Rebecca or anybody else in the trade union movement, for cross-union collaboration, and what do you think the prospects for that are going forward? Yeah, so that was it.
Okay, so the Delivering Community Power campaign that CUPW had is really exciting and inspirational. So I've just included a link there. They are this is a fantastic example of what could be accomplished with a just transition. So they know that their industry has been under attack. They're a publicly owned corporation. And they have a plan about how they could change the future. And it includes postal banking that invests in communities, the continuing door-to-door delivery of mail, medicines, groceries, and more. It includes things like having electric vehicle charging stations at post offices, having mail carriers be able to check in on seniors and people with mobility issues, which will allow them to stay in their homes longer. It also includes a consolidated last mile delivery service that eases congestions in urban centers and reduces the environmental impact on our cities. They also included the call for electrification of their fleet vehicles. And I mean, it's not just, I mean, when we're looking at Green Jobs Oshawa and the electrification of vehicles, we're calling for it to be anchored in government procurement. So that would mean municipalities, provincial and federal fleets. So there are all sorts of vehicles that need to be electrified. And I mean, obviously we need to re-examine how we do transportation as a whole, but this is an important first step. You know, another organization that is doing good work is the Lucas Plan, and they are organized out of the UK, and I'll include a link to them as well here. And their website also talks about a just transition and planning for socially useful production. And it's one of the ways, you know, we're talking about how do you build solidarity across borders. And one of the most important things that you can do is educate yourself about what's happening in other locations. If you don't know what's going on, then, I mean, you can't build solidarity at all. And take it upon yourself to look for it and then to share the information. Don't wait just for groups and organizations to say, hey, you should check this out. If you find something, share it, because it's a real weakness that we have right now, which is sharing good information. We know that corporations, multinational corporations, have no problem sharing best practices, but in the environmental movement and the labor movement, it's not a strong point. And there are all sorts of good ideas and plans and people who are on board with the same things that we're fighting for, and we're not finding effective ways of crossing lanes and getting out of our own silos.
So it looks like we have someone asking a question in the chat. It says, what is the single biggest external obstacle facing Green Jobs Oshawa's campaign to move the Oshawa Assembly Facility under public ownership? From Samuel Taylor.
So there are two big obstacles. The first is the political will. The second is that General Motors is maintaining some production and hasn't completely abandoned the plant, although 90% of it is abandoned. I mean, at its height, it had 23,000 workers in the plant. And by December, if we're lucky, there will be 300. So, but the biggest obstacle, I guess, is getting people to wrap their head around and applying. Like my when we first sent out our petition, I got a response from Colin Carey, who's a Conservative MP in Oshawa, who said that it's up to GM. GM owns the plant, and so it's up to them to do what they want. And I mean, that type of thinking is what's gotten us into this problem, because we need to think bigger and differently. I mean, it's I saw a meme somewhere that said people are able to imagine the end of the world easier than they're able to imagine changing the capitalist system, right? And that's a problem. So we have to think bigger. We have to try to raise the political will to make it change, because the only obstacle to this is the political will. GM has sold other plants for a song. So it's not about them being worried about competition. They haven't shown interest in producing vehicles in Canada. They've been withdrawing from producing vehicles in Canada. And there's a number of reasons for that, including globalization and free trade. But it's not something that they're ramping up that we'd be in competition with them for. So the biggest obstacle is political will.
So the floor is open if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to ask in the chat or by voice. If you'd like to ask by voice, you can message in the chat and one of the hosts can unmute you. I have one question for Rebecca, and this is just kind of reflecting on the success of the Green Jobs Oshawa campaign to get surgical masks being made right now. And I'm just wondering, how has this success, however small it may be, how has it changed how the organizing has developed in the last little while?
It was super exciting. So when Green Jobs Oshawa started, we recognized that calling for public ownership of the plant was a huge idea that is difficult for a lot of people to get on board with. Calling for the production of masks right now was something that seemed to resonate with people a lot easier, because they know that we're in a crisis and there's a lot of fear. Now, something that's really interesting is that the GM plant in Michigan, Warren, Michigan, is producing masks as well. So there's been a number of auto plants and other companies that have pivoted production and converted to producing PPE. This is something that they've been able to do sometimes in just a matter of weeks. So we know that conversion is possible, and having GM begin mask production in Oshawa is something that has really, I think, added some credibility to what we're calling for, because it shows that they can quickly pivot from vehicle production to something else, and they're doing it to meet public need. It's a government contract as far as I understand, but I mean, there's a widespread shortage of personal protective equipment, and it's costing lives.
Thank you. Nick has a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I have a comment and a question, Rebecca, and more generally. So you mentioned the Lucas site in the UK, and what reminded me of was what the Lucas struggle was. It goes back to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, there was an aircraft plant that was being closed. It was run by Lucas Aircraft in Britain. The workers got together with engineers and others, and they designed over 200 different things that plant could make, including hybrid buses, wheelchairs for kids with spina bifida, kidney dialysis machines, different types of advanced technology designed by the workers and engineers who worked there. and they organized for that, and their whole theory was the importance of social useful production. They didn't succeed because Lucas had more power. They simply refused. And that raises the question about how do we build a powerful enough social movement to accomplish these things. And I think that's an important discussion about how we link various movements, but in a broader agenda that's about how we transform and et cetera, particularly in this kind of time. I'd be interested in people's thoughts around how to link up. And related to that, a couple other specific, that's my comment more, so a couple specific questions. One is that the Green Jobs Oshawa organized a car cavalcade a couple weeks ago in Oshawa. And that was a form of action that can be taken in these difficult times. It's very hard for us to figure out how do we organize in these days. And I think it's important we find ways to do it. So I think it would be really helpful to hear a description of how that was done. And the second question I have is for people who are on the the call today. Is there any comments or questions they have around unions in themselves, how they're structured, how they work? Are people familiar with that, or is it something they're just not that familiar with? Because I think it's important to understand the structure of unions and what's going on in the union movement in order to be able to figure out what we as individuals can do.
Conversation around unions could be a whole another another series. I am very proud member of Unifor, and I don't always agree with everything that my union does, but I believe that unions are probably the most powerful democratic organizations that we as workers and individuals have in order to push for effective change. And I think it's really critical that environmentalists and people in the labor movement better learn how to work together, because we have a lot of common goals. There's so much common ground. The cavalcade was well attended. We had over 65 vehicles show up for that, which isn't bad for Oshawa. And that was done through email and phone conversations in reaching out to coalition members who reached out to their members. When I talk about, it was painful for GM to leave after they wrung so many concessions out of workers. And it isn't just low wage earners and workers in manufacturing positions that are having a very, very tough go of things. Precarious employment is a sickness and a disease that is going through all levels of employment. McMaster University did a study on precarious employment a while back, and it included temp use and contracts for positions like accountants as well. So just having a university education isn't going to protect you from precarious employment or shield you from the attack on workers' rights. In fact, I think that so many people who are in university are facing horrendous job opportunities and a lack of sufficient employment opportunities that provide good, stable employment. And so unions, anytime workers come together, whether it's associations or unions, people find common ground and try to come up with common solutions. And it's fighting back, because we know that, I think it's just in my lifetime that billionaires have become popularized. I mean, we had millionaires, but definitely not billionaires. And now they're talking about having our first trillionaire, right? And this is a complete failure of our economic system to distribute wealth properly and to look after its citizens properly. But if you do have an opportunity to be part of a union, whether it's your student union or if you are in part-time employment or full-time employment, I would strongly encourage you to take that opportunity. And I would add the caveat that it isn't always easy to become involved with your union. You have to make an effort, but anything that's worth having is worth fighting for. And so making that space and finding ways to get involved and have your voice heard is critically important, and it's up to you to do it.
Thank you, Rebecca. So the floor is open if anyone has any additional questions. We do have a few more opportunities for questions later, but I'd just like to maybe comment on the student unions and how youth can get involved that way. So I'm also organizing with the chapter of Fridays for Future for University of Toronto, as I'm going there next year. And Fridays for Future is setting up a bunch of student groups at various post-secondary organizations. And we are focused on making those connections with student unions to hopefully organize a collective strike. So we're trying to use the structures in place to continue mobilizing more people and using those unions as a way to build the power that we do need to get people on the streets. Okay. I'm going to continue through the presentation, and we'll have opportunity to ask some more questions and have discussion. So the segue into how can individuals support labor struggles and build links between our organizing is something that we discussed through our questions, and it gave us some good examples of different organizations that that we can do some research on and see how we can get involved and what we can share. Like Rebecca said, it's really important to share those resources with your circles rather than waiting for those resources to come to you, because there is a lot of chatter, and we need to make sure we're promoting and uplifting the actions and the campaigns that are having a good impact. So that being said, I just wanted to show two Just Recovery actions that people can also participate in online. So this is the 350.org Just Recovery Principles. They have the overall principles that I talked about today, and an open letter that you can sign for a just recovery from COVID-19. And there is also a Greenpeace action online. It's Bailout Workers, Not Oil and Gas, where you can also add your name and check out those demands as well. So I just wanted to open the floor to see if anyone had any other actions they wanted to share with us, so we can start building those links and getting amplifying those campaigns. So if anyone has any actions, please send the links into the chat, and we can share that on Fridays for Future Toronto. Okay, so I see there's Rebecca shared another one about warehouse workers. So please keep sending any other links in the chat. I'll be sharing them with everyone through the event page from today, so you can support these initiatives. So I just wanted to bring up a few examples of where Fridays for Future has created links between our youth organizing and labor organizing. And some of the examples we talked about today. So obviously Green Jobs Oshawa, we've been in communication with folks like Rebecca and inviting Rebecca to come talk at this event, but also at the Global Climate Strikes, and continuing that conversation. Food Stirrers United, through the gig economy organizing, building links with the elementary teachers of Toronto and other teachers' unions. So leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were trying to support the teacher strikes. So we attended the teacher strike at Queen's Park when all 4 teachers' unions were marching the picket lines, but we also attended some of the strikes going to different high schools and elementary schools while teachers were picketing. Increasing connections to healthcare sector and unions through SEIU, and the Fight for 15 and Fairness, which focuses on low wage and service sector organizing. So these are just a few examples. We've also created links with individuals in labor organizing roles, and specifically with some of the coalition of different groups with union members to talk about how climate intersects with labor. But we do want to continue creating these links, and it is essential to build the power we need for these demands, because it is definitely a problem knowing that people see the end of the world as a more plausible thing than actually changing the system. So I just wanted to open the floor again to having some questions. So this will be the final question opportunity. And maybe I can ask Rebecca this question, which would be, how can we engage with outside of the workplace to get within the community? How have you incorporated that into your organizing, and how has that been successful or otherwise to kind of bridge the gap between organizing within the workplace and organizing within the community?
So I think most of Green Jobs Oshawa organizing has been outside of the workplace. It's really a coalition. So we've had input and help from professors at the Ontario Tech University. We've had help from the Council of Canadians and from LEAP, from the Socialist Project in Toronto, from Futures for Friday. Sorry, brain. But it is about having conversations, and often one of the most important things is to listen, not just be talking. So when we're having conversations with people about change and what's possible, of course you want to make your point, but it's really important to listen to what other people are saying, to understand what they're fearful of or why they're resistant to the ideas, and to make space for them to express it in a safe way. The conversations aren't always easy. I mean, something else that's really important is consensus building in the group of people that you're working with. It doesn't always work out well if you say, okay, we've had a good talk, now let's take a vote and see what we're going to do. That may be expedient, but it isn't necessarily going to get you the best results. So sometimes it's better to take more time with the people that you're working with and have those fuller conversations and come to consensus. The other thing is trust. You have to really trust the people that you're working with. Everybody has something to offer. Everybody can step up to the plate. You have to make room for people to step up to the plate. And that can be really, really challenging as well. But it's all part of good organizing, right? Organizing should grow and bring people in. It shouldn't just be about egos or what's going on with a couple of individuals.
Thank you. So I have maybe one more question that's more pointed at youth voices. So many youth are also workers, often working in gig economy or other low-income service jobs with no union. And I'm just wondering how youth voices can contribute to greater labor organizing. If you had a comment on that.
If I have a comment on that?
Yeah.
On how, well, so a lot of jobs that youths get into are precarious employment because they're trying to go to school at the same time they're trying to make, these days it's money to survive on. It's not just extra cash, but they're not known to be dense with unions. So, I think something that happens is you become accustomed to a system that isn't very healthy. And we need to be aware of the system that we're entering as we start in the workforce, right? So be aware of what's happening and why are you getting the low wages that you're getting? Who's getting all the money that you're earning for the company, and what's happening with that money, and why does it have to be that way? I would strongly suggest staying in touch with workers' organizations. So like there's labor councils around, there's student unions, there's, what's really important is being involved politically. And again, that isn't something that is very easy to break into all the time, but sending letters to your politicians and getting to know who your representatives are, and on a municipal level as well, because it's these connections that you can make, particularly, when you're young. All these older people want to hear from you when you're young. As you get older, they're less interested in hearing what you have to say for the most part. But if you're when you're a younger person and you say, I have something to say, or I have an idea to put forward, it's a lot easier to find the space to be heard if people would just take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you. So we have, I see there's 2 more questions, and we're a little bit past our time, but there's one from Samuel and from Nick. Nick, did you want to speak first?
I can wait. I can let Samuel, because we're low on time. If Samuel wants to go ahead with that question, it's fine.
Okay, so he wrote it in the chat, so I'm just going to read it. It says, during a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, what are examples of other climate/labor policies that can complement the movements from private to public ownership?
Climate labor policies. Well, something we need to look at getting away from mass production and extreme consumerism, right? It's wasteful and it's harmful, and we have this is just basic common sense stuff that I'm saying that I'm sure everybody's already aware of, right? But instant gratification and the need to instantly have things provided to us in ready and disposable is a big problem. So I don't know that exactly is an official climate labor policy, but it's definitely has to be a component of planning for need instead of greed and what's good for society. I think I saw we need to find a way to make sure that corporations are responsible for the full cost of their production. So including cleanup, and that they can't get away from the environmental costs that go along with it. A lot of times, and you've seen it with oil production, corporations make billions of dollars, and then when it's time for cleanup, it's socialized and governments pay for it. So I mean, policies like that are important. I mean, there's other things that we can talk about. You know, there's things that moving to public pensions, full health care, so that people aren't relying on their employer provided benefits for medication. These are things that will make it easier to move from private to public when we don't have to rely on private corporations for everything. Basic income, reduction in working hours, higher wages, a fairer share of what you earn. I'm not sure if this is quite what you were hoping to get with this question.
Yeah, I think that was a good answer of the general kind of things that the question was touching on. And oh, he says, that's great, thank you. So I just wanted to wrap up our teach-in today just with a few ending notes. So basically, I just wanted to say that as we continue to organize and we're online in times of the pandemic, it's important to continue considering how to build collective power while we're unable to actually disrupt business as usual in the streets. And we've seen many initiatives to mobilize individuals and information about a just recovery. So we have demonstrated an ability for communities to come together. And I just want to emphasize a lot of our discussion today was talking about how it's important to continue building the links to foster the connections that are important foundations for our continued resilience within the community. And in order to lift up those campaigns and the voices of people that are helping to move us in the right direction. And just as a last thing, we have to remember that for the COVID-19 pandemic, it's a very current issue. And as we move forward, the climate crisis is still looming over us, and we are in the last decade where we're able to act. So we have to keep that in mind when we are continuing to demand better and include it into our organizing, our labor organizing and our environmental organizing in conjunction with labor organizing. So just as a final slide, I've just included our website, our social media pages, and our email. So please check out our website for some more information and follow our social media pages. And if you have any questions about today's teach-in or about anything related to our organizing, you can email us at fridaysforfuture@gmail.com. And I'll be posting the links to all of the resources that were shared today in the chat. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone who stayed, and we hope that this was informative. And thank you again to Rebecca for coming on as our guest speaker. I think that your perspective was definitely enlightening and really informative in how we can continue to organize and have the impact on climate and labor struggles. Thank you.
Really appreciate being able to participate in this. And you know, I think the most important thing is just not to wait for somebody to reach out to you to get involved, to find ways to participate, however that is, because oftentimes the places that we think that should be excited to have us show up and help out don't have welcoming arms. They have their own way of doing things, or they don't have space necessarily. So it's important that you make your own space and don't wait to be asked. Just get involved.
Agreed. Thank you. Brian and Nick, did you want to say some parting words?
I just following up on what Rebecca just said. Rebecca's been an activist for quite a long time. She was in the plant, led a lot of battles and fights for more participation and changing some of the workplace situation, and is a good example of what that's all about, what you just described, Rebecca. And also, I think you hit on the point that the key thing is organizing. So the union movement's been essentially decimated in the last couple of decades. But there are workplaces now where young people are, and organizing unions there is probably one of the most decisive things that has to be done. So taking up that initiative, I think, is really important. I just also want to mention that it's also true that the union movement has been influenced by political movements historically. So the women's movement, or the anti-war movement, the women's movement, and the environmental movement all had their impacts within the union movement eventually. So the building of the movements outside of labor, quote unquote, is a very powerful tool in terms of changing what's happening within the labor movement. I think it's important to understand that as well. But thank you very much for this. I enjoyed participation. Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Thank you, Rebecca. I've been trying to promote the Green Jobs Oshawa campaign for quite a while now, and we need to keep pushing. And I also just want to thank our other host, Kendall, for a great presentation as well. And thank you very much for all the work you put into this.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.